Nesbitt, who has written a PhD dissertation on the Ontario Days of Action and is an editor at Rank and File.
Thanks to the organizers for having me, and thank you for the wonderful theater that we just had. There's no way I can possibly top that. What I'm going to do tonight is give a kind of a context, a brief history leading up to the Metro Days of Action, and if we have some time, I'll do some comments about what happens after the Metro Days of Action. And with the slides here, I'll be throwing in a few cartoons like this, which I found the most kind of illuminating aspects of what's going on in the mid to late 90s. And this would have been funnier about 3 years ago, so sorry. Next slide. So Toronto is where the boss lives. This is from Gord Wilson, the OFL president at the time. This is his rationale for why are we targeting Toronto. We're targeting Toronto because it's Bay Street. It's where all the big businesses are. It's where the Mike Harris government has tied itself to those interests, and it's where workers have the power to really deal a blow against the Harris government and the common sense revolution. Just tap it a few times. There we go. So I'm going to briefly go through what was the common sense revolution. I was only 16 at the time when the teachers' strike happened, so I knew it was happening, but I didn't really know what was going on. I spent my time playing road hockey for those 2 weeks instead of going to the picket line. I do remember the London Days of Action as well, which is where I grew up, and that was a really big deal. But as you know, a teenager, I was kind of not fully aware of what was going on. It was only later through the anti-globalization movement and becoming politicized and getting active in my first union, which was at a grocery store, that I realized that there is this giant shadow hanging over everything, and it was called the common sense revolution. And really the last decade of being in university, studying in a history program, has been kind of me trying to understand what was the common sense revolution, and what is its legacy, and why did the Days of Action, where did they come from, how did they happen, and what happened to them? Why did they end up, I guess we would say, being defeated in many ways, but also holding out some really profound lessons for how we organize against Ford today. What was the common sense revolution? The way I would always introduce it is it's a response emerging out of all the crises that are happening in the early 90s. There's a huge economic crisis and here in Toronto, it's also a huge housing crisis, where housing prices start to collapse. It's a huge crisis in manufacturing, where the private sector unions are getting hammered. It's a huge crisis politically because we had elected an NDP government, and by 1992 and 1993, the pressures of the economic crisis, the pressures from their political opponents, the pressures from increasingly organized business lobby, basically the NDP begins to backslide on a lot of their promises of building this much improved welfare state and a more just society, and beginning to introduce the beginnings of what we now understand as austerity measures. So of course, the big infamous social contract, which I'm sure many people can talk about, but also attacks on social assistance that in many ways prefigure what Harris does. Harris kind of takes it to a new level with the attacks on social assistance. So there is austerity that's beginning, and it's in that context that disillusion around the NDP project, the disarray politically that's going on in response to the economic crisis, the rise of new right forces, getting more confidence in those years. Only a few months before Harris is elected in November '94, you have Newt Gingrich's Republican Revolution, which is an extension of the Reagan project. The Tories are very much drawing on what the Thatcher government had done in Britain as well. They see their entire project as halting and then reversing this welfare state that kept building in the post-war period, to restructure the entire province along the lines of permanent austerity. Say it a couple times and just bring them all in. There we go. How are they going to achieve this? it's already been laid out. Budget cuts, means testing for all sorts of programs, introduction of new user fees, divestment from all sorts of government assets, the privatization of those assets and services. You know, if you've been around the labor movement and you know that you might know the term management by stress, the idea is really just to speed up whole sorts of new techniques being brought into the public service and elsewhere to squeeze more out of people. It's what Alan Sears, a professor, sociologist here in Toronto, calls the lean state. It's like, you know, it's lean and mean. It's a lean and mean state that's being developed. How is this achieved? How is popular sentiment mobilized behind it? It's tapping in to real grievances that people have, but it's reframing those grievances, and it's finding scapegoats to redirect those grievances, scapegoating the poor, scapegoating minorities, scapegoating women, scapegoating unions, all basically the forces who rise up against the common sense revolution. And it's also worth remembering that there were a couple carrots thrown into the common sense revolution program. There was a 30% income tax cut, which I know is has a double-edged sword. Something like 60% of the wealth of that tax cut went to the top 10% income earners. But they also promised that there wouldn't be any healthcare cuts, and that really proved not to be true. Here's just, I won't, sorry, there must be more times.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So, there we go, that's perfect. So this is just the laundry list. I don't want to go into too much detail, but these are some of the snapshots of what happened in that first term, what the common sense revolution really consisted of. Upwards of $1 billion of education cut out of $4.8 billion. Tuition fee hikes, and that structural dependency of the universities on tuition fees instead of government grants, or changing of the funding model. Massive wave of hospital closures, huge cuts, the creation of, you know, this expansion of this massive long-term care and home care industry that is super low wage, super non-union, especially at the time, and is going to lowest for-profit bidders. The social assistance cuts, you know, 21.6%, just like that, October 1st, 1995. The attempt to introduce workfare, which is on the books, but it gets derailed through CUPE's boycott of the United Way, which maybe people might remember that. Massive cuts to infrastructure, the complete destruction of a housing program in this province, the cancellation of thousands of co-op units that were in development at the time, massive divestment, downloading. Everybody knows the 407 story is a huge example. Transit capital expenditures frozen. The Eglinton subway, at the cost of $300 million already spent, is literally filled in. And then, of course, restructuring the labor market. You know, Bill 7 is the big labor bill. Bill 8 is the repeal of employment equity. Bill 99 is the destruction of workers' comp, at least at the level that it existed at the time. And then there's Bill 136 and Bill 160 that lead to the big fights, the kind of last gasp of resistance against the Harris Common Sense Revolution in the fall of '97. And then some people may remember other forms of restructuring legislation like Bill 26, which I think it was 2,600 pages, and it kind of is a model for what Harper does almost 20 years later. So here's your Eglinton subway, and he says, voila, room aplenty for those needing welfare, daycare, or elderly cooperative living space. And then there is the who likes the 30% tax cut while all the other cuts are going on. Next slide, please. So just I think a couple more times. This is not sure which protest that is. Okay, so what happens? There's a massive popular response that develops that leads directly into the days of action. The first one in December '95 in London, almost a year before the Metro days of action. But it starts small in the summer of '95. There's independent initiatives by all sorts of groups, all sorts of activists, all sorts of trade unionists, but there isn't really the big trade union, official trade union muscle behind it. A lot of single issue demands, sectoral demands, but as the attack starts to unroll through the late summer and into the fall, the breadth of that attack generates the conditions for that unity, creates the conditions for that common front, and begins in a series of protests that start to unroll, like the September 95 protest at the legislature when it opened. 10,000 people show up. There's this confidence and this momentum and a development of organizational capacities. And that really spurs, the big battalions of labor with the labor leadership into action. A few unions in particular are really spearheading this, and the CAW is right at the forefront, the auto workers. And at the 95 OFL convention in November, that's where the decision is made, is formalized for the days of action. And the model in London is the model that is replicated with every day of action after that. There's a community labor coalition where there's this recognition that this isn't just about the labor movement, this is about the entire working class, this is about all communities who are being affected. So the days of action organizing committees have both a labor and a community component, a labor and a community leadership. There's a very open recognition that Mike Harris is serving these corporate interests, these business interests. So if we hammer them, that's his weak spot. If we hammer the employers, that is going to make them scream, and they are going to begin to tell the Harris government that, let's pump the brakes a little bit on these reforms. The unions unroll internal education programs and start moving towards mass meetings and strike votes is leading up to London. And this sort of pattern is followed in the subsequent days of action. London, nobody knows what's going to happen going into the London Day of Action, but it's a huge success. 15,000 people march in like minus 25 weather.
Minus 40.
Minus 40. That's with wind chill, right? Okay.
That's right. We didn't have wind chill in those days.
Can you go to the next slide? So here are just some headlines from that autumn of 95 that kind of capture the militancy and the exuberance and the anger that's directed at Harris, at Sabuchi. People probably have stories about Sabuchi's welfare diet, where he talks about, find dented tins of tuna at the store and then haggle with the grocer. You can save money that way. Just really disgusting stuff. Harris got egged at Oktoberfest that year as well. Probably one of my favorites is a Tory fundraiser. I think it's in November 95 in Concord, where these fancy cars are pulling in to go to this $150, $200 plate protest, and the reports are that the people are smearing the cars with bologna sandwiches and tuna sandwiches. So, well, Harris at the time said, hey, I know what it's like to live rough. I grew up on bologna sandwiches. And then his dad the next day in the press says, no, you didn't. Go to the next slide. All right, I wasn't at the Metro Days of Action, so I think the stories are all here. And so I'm not going to tell the stories. I'm just going to give you just a kind of snapshot of what happened. Over 500 picket lines on the Friday. So Friday's the strike, Saturday's the mass march. Now I put 150,000. I don't know what the numbers were, but they're huge. People said upwards of 250,000. I know Billy Gregg said that. Organizers were definitely saying over 150,000. The press and the police totally lowballed it. But it was, at the time, I believe, the largest demonstration in Canadian history at that time. I think maybe the Montreal anti-war protests in 2003 topped it. And the school systems, the school boards that did stay open in the Metro Toronto area, there was only 10 to 15% student attendance. In terms of provincial workers across Metro Toronto, the 50 to 75% absentee rate, 90% for federal workers, 75% for City of Toronto workers, and then the other cities that got amalgamated the next year, anywhere from 25 to 40% absentee rates. In the private sector, big factories, de Havilland, Nestle, Chrysler, Loomis, a lot of the unionized logistics companies, Molson's, A.G. Simpson, CAW alone shut down 70 plants across Metro. And then in the public sector, and this is the real crucial one, and I did do interviews, I just didn't read newspapers, but I did do interviews, and all the Toronto people said the TTC was the key. If we could shut down the TTC, we shut down the city. Capital cannot function, the businesses cannot function if people can't get to work. So the TTC was a big fight, and it was shut down. The Ontario Food Terminal, Hydro Workers, Canada Post, LCBO, the provincial, the municipal, the federal buildings, all shut down by this huge wave of strike action and picket lines. So here we go. This captures, this one's kind of funny, there's protests in Toronto, it's a funny joke. This one here is kind of very typical of the naysayers and the Tories and I'm not going to tell you I'm a Tory, but I'm actually a Tory types at the time, where these protests only hurt people. There are other ways, like waiting 4 years and voting in another election. This is not the way you go about getting your message across. And so this is pretty typical of the anti-protest rhetoric that was going on at the time. Here's some more. Pretty self-evident, Days of Action and Reaction. This one is actually from the fall of '97, so I'm cheating. That's around the teachers' strike. One more, and that is, don't worry, this one goes with the slide. So what happened to the movement? I don't want to get totally hung up on this. We can talk for ages about these sorts of questions, but after the Metro Days of Action, there was a very open and nasty split within the OFL, within the labor movement, between the unions who wanted to keep going with the Days of Action, with certain reservations in some cases, and then there was the group of unions who wanted to wind this down and put all the resources into voting the NDP. And that split was very damaging. In the following year, in '97, was the big battles over the hospital closures. And the Days of Action was disconnected from it. There was another Day of Action in Sudbury and Thunder Bay and in the late winter into the spring, but they were small affairs, while massive protests were going on around the hospitals. The movement revived. There was another big challenge around Bill 136 and Bill 160 in September and October and into November of '97. Bill 136 was gutted when CUPE started taking strike votes around the province for a province-wide strike, a legal strike. The Tories backed down and made a calculation, well, maybe we'll just go after the teachers. They kept Bill 160 on the books. And unfortunately, Bill 160 wasn't defeated by the teachers' strike, even though it was a hugely popular strike. The Days of Action end following really in the months after the November '97 OFL convention. There's a big battle over who leads the OFL. Gord Wilson steps down. He doesn't run again. And two candidates representing those two factions of the movement battle each other. It's very close. And the new leader of the OFL, Wayne Samuelson, he's not here, is he? That under his leadership, and we can't put it all on him, but that leadership, that new leadership, it waits months until the St. Catharines Day of Action to call another action, and after a couple of relatively small days of action, they're shelved in the summer of 1998. And the CAW leadership, the CUPE leadership, they go along with this because they realize the momentum is gone. There's been a demoralization, and we need to figure out a new way of where to go. And the kind of real, kick when we're down was that Harris did win the following election, and there's again another discussion we can have about that. What I would really argue is that, that crisis that the Days of Action forced on the Harris government, that was the promise that would bring him down in the next election, kind of looking back on it, it seems like taking the pedal off the gas was the mistake, but then we get into debates about escalation and the province-wide strike. So there's an ongoing debate about that. But Harris does win through a period of economic recovery. Unemployment starts to fall. The federal government kind of retreats from its really austere agenda of their first term and starts doing modest reinvestments into the provinces through transfers. And it's in that second term of the Harris government that all the really the nastiest, most really the deadly effects of the government really undermine the Harris government. There's the awful, tragic death of Kimberly Rogers, who was under house arrest because of violating laws around social assistance. She died under house arrest. Dudley George's murder stayed on the, people kept it as on the front burner, and that really started to heat up. That kept harassing, chasing Harris around the province. Then there was the Walkerton tragedy, where privatization of water testing failed, and people died, and hundreds of people got sick in Walkerton. And then, of course, there was the hydro privatization, that when they deregulated hydro rates and then had to quickly re-regulate them, that was kind of the coup de grace for the Harris Tories. So that's kind of a snapshot of what happened at the end after the Metro days of action. So I will hand it over, and thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Bill Howes worked for the Toronto and York Region Labour Council for many years and was a key organizer of the Metro Days of Action.
Thank you very much, Doug. I don't know how much more I can add to this. You've done a very comprehensive job, followed by the Toronto Worker Theatres Group. I think much of what I had planned to say has been said. I'll try to briefly edit my notes as I go, and not take up too much of your time, because I think that the bulk of this meeting, I hope, will be used to talk about the future and not the past. The leadership team that organized the Metro Days of Action comprised about 70-odd staff people and some 70-odd members of a joint steering committee comprised of social justice people and labor people. The organizing team, the smaller organizing team that did the day-to-day nuts and bolts work, were Linda Torney and Margaret Hancock. Both of them were the media face and the spokespersons for the venture, and Paul Forder and myself as sort of the behind-the-scenes organizers. My background was some 25 years at that time, I guess, organizing experience. And I had also been involved in setting up the Metro Network for Social Justice in Toronto, and working with Jim Turk, who's here today, on earlier days of action, and also on the building of the Ontario Coalition for Social Justice. I started with the Labour Council in 1989, and became very soon, by choice, became heavily involved with the Metro Network for Social Justice, to the point where the good bulk of my time at work was spent working with and helping to build the Metro Network. And I think that helped to lay the groundwork for the success that we had with the Days of Action. I also served on the organizing committee. The OFL formed an organizing committee of representatives of different unions, different affiliated unions, and I sat in on that committee as a representative of the Toronto Labour Council. In that capacity, I helped the organizing in virtually all of the Days of Action, certainly the London, the initial one, and most of the others, all of the others that came before Toronto. With adopting the slogan, organize, educate, and resist, we started to build the nuts and bolts for the campaign. We rented an office up in Young and Shepherd. We eventually had a staff, as I mentioned, a full-time staff of about 7-8 people in that office. We had media specialists, we had other communication specialists. We recruited organizers, we brought in some organizers and housed them in Toronto, some experienced organizers from the Windsor CAW locals. And we began to organize participation by the locals and social justice organizations. One of my jobs was to handle the marshalling of the Days of Action, and in that capacity I wrote marshal training instructions. I conducted training courses for marshals, and one of the more unpleasant tasks that I had was liaison with the police at various levels. In that capacity, I met with the RCMP, the OPP, the Toronto Police, Peel Region Police, and even the Speaker of the Ontario Legislature to try to assure them that we were going to handle the marshalling of these events ourselves, and we did not need or want police participation in them. In our organizing, we managed to get our materials, the basic materials, translated into 17 different languages. We had leaflets available and distributed in various sectors around Toronto in 17 languages. We sent media releases to 45 different ethnic media outlets in Toronto, and our ads ran on Chin Radio in 35 different languages. We raised the funds to pay for the Days of Actions primarily from the labor movement, and in all we raised something a little over $500,000, and we spent just under that amount. I think we're $30,000 over that we put towards organizing future Days of Action. About 1/3 of the money that we raised were in selling the t-shirts and sweatshirts and buttons and caps and all of the various paraphernalia that are associated with an event that size. It was just 7 weeks before the Days of Action in Metro started that we rented the office, and really the day after Labor Day, September the 3rd, was when we opened that office and started to organize on a full-time basis. And we built it as we got closer to the Days of Action. The coordinating committee, I think I mentioned, was built from labor representatives in the Metro Toronto and the Labour Council, and also social justice communities. And that organizing committee met on a weekly basis to make the major decisions involved in organizing the Days of Action. We subscribed to Bowden's, which is a media tracking company, and we learned that 565 TV shots on the media Metro Days of Action lasting 60 seconds or longer occurred over that brief period in the week in October. So tremendous media coverage, and much of that was due to the work done by our two media spokespersons, Linda and Margaret Hancock. On October the 21st, a Sun CFRB poll indicated that 67% of the people in metropolitan Toronto did not support the MDA. That's 5-6 days before the strike, the one-day strike. And on October the 26th, an Angus Reid poll indicated that 55% now believed that the government should reconsider cuts to the public sector. So over that short period of time, the media coverage that we got and the exposure that we got through interactions with the public had switched public opinion significantly. Attempts at injunctions were made. There were a number of attempts at injunctions. None of them were really successful. They were defeated in most courts. Injunctions at Pearson Airport, and that's one of the things that really worried the Tories, that we would shut down the airport. Those injunctions were largely very narrow and vague and pretty much ineffective. On Wednesday and Thursday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of the week of action in Toronto, community action events were held across the city. Joan Roberts, who's here with us, was one of the leaders in the city of York, where she was a councillor in the city of York at the time. Community events were usually paired with significantly influential unions in that area, so that the building trades would work with a community, the steelworkers would work with a community, the auto workers would work with a community. And that way we tried to foster this cross-communication between our movement and social justice communities. In all, on the 25th of October, my figures show that we had cross-picketed some 300 different work sites in Toronto. The shutdown of the TTC, of course, was very significant, and it meant that 1.3 million commuters either stayed home or they found alternate means of communication, of transportation. The Toronto Star even went to the point of hiring a boat to try to get people, their employees, into their location at number 1 Yonge Street. So they went to drastic measures. There were stories of companies buying up supplies of air mattresses so their employees could spend the night sleeping on the floors of their offices. That was one of the more humorous aspects of the days of action. I think one of the, in all, our figures were about 250,000. The police, it's interesting to note, the police estimated at 75,000. Now, I know that there was a huge number of people. I was watching my role on the actual day of the march was in the 7th floor of the OPSU building on University Avenue, and looking up and down University Avenue. The march had not left, the head of the march had arrived at Queen's Park before the tail of the march had left Coronation Park down the lakeshore. So there's no way that it was 75,000. It was a huge number of people, and it was clearly the largest demonstration in Toronto's history, probably in Canadian history at that time. One of the major accomplishments, to my mind, and looking back on it today, was that it helped to bring the teachers' unions very much into the mainstream of the labor movement. They had not been, prior to that, many of them had been sort of kept a distance from the general labor movement, with the exception of the OSSTF, the secondary school teachers. But it was instrumental in bringing those groups into the mainstream of the labor movement, and it was a tremendous contribution in that regard. I'd like to leave you with a few quotes, and then I guess we can get into some questions and answers. Quotes that I think were useful, and I found these in doing my research in preparation for tonight. I went through my old files and some of the articles that were read and in those days. And one of the quotes says, "No matter what you think of the Metro Days of Action organizers' tactics, when you get this kind of street level activity, it's exciting. This is exciting." That quote was from Christy Blatchford, right-wing news reporter speaking on CFRB. One of the more favorable quotes is, "Toronto was magic. We turned a Friday into a Sunday, and we turned a coalition into a movement." And that was Sam Gidnon speaking in Briarpatch magazine. And finally, quote, "We are stronger than we were before. We no longer feel the rule of greed is an inevitable fate. We feel there's hope. And hey, if we can stop a city like Toronto, what can't we stop? No one can take these days away from us. They are ours." And that was Lorraine Endicott in Our Times magazine. So I'll leave you with that, and just if I can make one personal observation, I'm really heartened to hear Doug's presentation tonight. I'm really heartened to see young people showing an interest in what was done in the past, because they are the future, and I think they're valuable lessons to be learned for all of us from the Metro Days of Action. Thank you.